Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today we're talking about the third album from Biosphere. Substrata. Alright, this is the big one. If you only know one Biosphere album, it's probably this one. If you don't know any Biosphere albums, most people will point you here. It's considered a classic by most people who have any passing interest in ambient music. I've even heard people tell me that they personally consider it worthy of a perfect 10 out of 10 score. There's a ton of hype around this album, to say the very least. It's been canonized as an ambient classic. As for me personally, well, okay, it's not a 10 for me, but may as well feed directly into that hype. Yeah, I agree with the majority on this one. Not only is it easily my favorite Biosphere album, it's one of my favorite albums of all time. I ranked it at number 47 when I made my favorites of all time list in 2016. That said, this was an exceptionally difficult review to get myself motivated to write. Not because there's necessarily a lack of things to talk about, but more because when I listen to this album, I straight up do not feel like talking about it or even really thinking about it. This is one of those albums that every time I listen to it, without fail, feels like it can take me to another place. The sense of space and just overall production is just immaculate across the board. Yeah, it's definitely not a 10 for me. If I'm gonna give out that score to an album, then every single track needs to have a really strong personal connection with me and feel like an integral part of my life. And of the 11 tracks on this album, really only 2 approach that level for me. Those being Poa Alpina and Kobresia. The rest is all great and fits together really well, but don't get that same kind of emotional rush out of me that some of the stuff higher up in my personal ranking do. But whatever, I won't dwell on that. I honestly wouldn't have even thought about bringing up the topic if I hadn't gotten a commenter a while back telling me that they consider this album a 10 and gave me a jumping on point of discussion so I could actually start on work on this video. But yes, Substrata is a classic. It's an all-time favorite. It's probably the reason the majority of you were excited for this series in the first place. Let's get into it. So of course, yes, this is an entirely ambient album. Not a single percussion element to be found anywhere, completely reliant on its cold and distant atmosphere that seems to be meant to take you out into the vast reaches of the Arctic. In order to set that up, first it gives you an intro of pure field recording with As the Sun Kissed the Horizon. And even if it is so simple and non-musical, it does immediately set up that environment, and the sound of airplanes passing overhead actually does effectively get you in the right mood in order to get you into the album proper. And then we get the opener, the above-mentioned Poa Alpina, which is absolutely gorgeous. Not much more than a progression of muffled synth chord pads that repeats over and over and is a couple of guitar plucking sounds here and there too. Just that chord progression creates this absolutely chilling and haunting feeling. It feels giant and expansive despite having so few elements going into it. I don't feel like it can properly be explained in words, it just needs to be heard to be believed. We then move on to Chukhung, which feels like it's sinking us deeper into an icy cave, purely through very slow and reverb-soaked little synth stabs, slightly building into other subtle and repetitive synth progressions and some very lo-fi sounding guitars, and then leading into the spacey tones of The Things I Tell You, which kinda calls back to the most low-key moments of his first 2 albums, with its very blocky 90s synth pads forming very static and regular rhythms, alongside acid-heavy progressions in the back half. Though even these sounds are surrounded by lots of other much smoother and more airy and bassy synth textures that help make everything fit together so well. Also, our first voice sample comes in at one point. "Sorry to wake you. I forgot to tell you. The things I tell you will not be wrong." Main tracks on here incorporate vocal samples, and all of them are really memorable in that way. Even if that sentence doesn't really mean anything, it just sticks in the head. Like, all the vocal samples on here always stick out in that way, like they're desert islands in a giant ocean of ambience. This track isn't even one of the most memorable moments on the album as a whole, but it is another necessary point of interest. Anyways, then there's Times When I Know You'll Be Sad, which I'll admit was always one of the lower points for me until fairly recently. It's mostly just a repetitive guitar loop and a vocal sample saying the title over and over, and doesn't really go much further than that. I mainly remember not liking the presence of this vocal sample, even if it didn't necessarily feel out of place. I just kind of wanted instrumentals. Though the track being one of the shortest on here, combined with the loops it runs with for almost its full running time, getting increasingly catchy and really easy to recall, it made it a particular grower as of very recently. It never actually felt shorter than the other tracks on here, which may stretch on for 5, 6, 7, one nearly 8-minute track. This one's only like 3.5 minutes, but it now just feels like just as important a part of the album as any other. And it leads directly into Hyperborea, a possible Tangerine Dream reference with the title there. That has a much more intense feeling with its unnerving synth pad alongside all these gurgling effects. And probably my favorite of the vocal samples incorporated in this album. In my vision, I was on the veranda of a vast estate, palazzo of some fantastic proportion. Though this track is also accompanied by several layers of bleeping progressions that have maybe more of a major key adherence, makes the track feel significantly less ominous than the way it starts. Anyways, next there's my other giant favorite from this album, Kobresia. This is another track that I don't know if I really have the words to properly describe it, mostly centered around a progression of repetitive and smooth synth chord pads, much like those on Poa Alpina, though the vibe given off by these progressions is quite different from the chilling effects created by that track. This is much more laid back and tranquil, and somehow even more expansive and giant sounding. The kind of thing that has me envisioning flying over vast landscapes. I could seemingly listen to that progression of pads on loop forever. It's just so uplifting and incredible, yet so stripped back and subtle at the same time. There's other elements of this track too, like the Russian rambling voice sample in the beginning, the subtle guitar picking in the middle, and near the end the main progression unfortunately goes away, but gives way to just the lowest end, a single bassy fifth, alongside several field recordings and radio buzzing and more guitar plucking carried over from earlier on. The 7.5 minutes of this track just seemed to zip by in an instant. Even in spite of its length, I could have lingered there much longer. Thankfully, the next track, Antennaria, is also a big highlight, perhaps not too far away from, tracks like Poa Alpina. Again, just a simple progression of synth chords, but only 2 chords this time that move very slowly, have a different kind of haunting and subtly unnerving feel to them. There's more simple guitar plucking and clinking bell sounds, and one lo-fi sample of a full choir that appears and disappears at regular intervals. Another one of the best moments. Then there's Uva Ursi, which is probably the fastest tempo on any track here. It's one guitar chord played repeatedly with some little synth plucking and maybe this faux choral pad surrounding it. This track admittedly feels like little more than an interlude to me for the most part. It's the shortest track on here, discounting the intro at only 3 minutes. So, I suppose that stands to reason. Not really a track that I think necessarily adds a lot, but not one I would ever skip either. Finally, we got 2 more tracks. First there's Sphere of No Form, which goes for a much more atonal or dissonant feel than most of the other tracks on here. It has this airy and harsh whistling wind pad, now counting the actual wind field recording in the beginning, along these other giant pads that sound like foghorns blaring in the distance. It's a track that feels much darker and more metallic than most other tracks on here, and reminds me of like some giant steamship sailing through a blizzard. Well, in its first half. The second half brings in some more peaceful chords to accompany the other textures and calm the vibe down more, perhaps make it feel more nocturnal. Then, at long last, we emerge at the album's ending, Cyclone. It's another track with a progression of synth chords, although this one is much more ambiguous and not really forming a ton of traditional harmonies, alongside some other clanking and squeaking and possibly guitar sounds that more resemble machinery, kinda staying in those repetitive loops the whole time until it finally fades out into more field recordings at the very end that feel like you're emerging from the cracking ice. I swear this track was briefly used in like the intro or ending of one of those Submachine games by Matthew Skutnik, but I could just be confusing similar sounding pieces. But yeah, admittedly this track is maybe a bit of a strange place to finish from an emotional standpoint, and I don't know if it's necessarily the most impactful ending you could have possibly picked. Bit repetitive as well, but I'm too used to its placement to want to move it. So that's the album itself. Now to talk about the bonus material. And this is the one Biosphere album where I'm actually excited to talk about the bonus material, since you can tell from the non-standard album cover that's been sitting next to me. The version I'm used to is not the original, which has this cover that's not as good. The version I'm used to is a reissue called Substrata 2. Like the reissues of Microgravity and Potashnik, there's an entire second disc of material. Though unlike those, first of all, on my version, the bonus material is put in first with the main album placed afterwards. And I actually think that ordering is to the album's benefit. The bonus album does sort of work better like a prequel to the main album. You're impressed by the subtlety in the beginning and get even more wowed when the album proper finally starts. So that's why this particular version is my favorite. So okay, the bonus album. It's 9 tracks, 7 of which work together as a rescoring of the film Man with a Movie Camera, 2 of which are bonus tracks that were previously included with the Japanese version of the original album. And depending on what version of the album you also have, there's another 14-minute bonus track tacked on at the end called Laika. On Spotify, that's all tacked on to the standard edition, which I think was reissued in like 2011 or something like that. Now, despite this all being bonus material, and as you would expect, not as good as the main album, it's really not that far behind. It's obviously similar enough to work in the same listening package, though it's just different enough to justify keeping it around, tending towards somewhat more unnerving and experimental atmosphere than the main album typically falls towards. It feels like it's a proper expansion on the main album that complements it really well and makes the listening experience all the more varied and evocative, and just as worth analysis as the main album is. A track like the opener, The Silent Orchestra, for instance, has a much more atonal and spooky vibe to it than most of the main album. Just these windy and cold paths with occasional blocky chords coming in and subtle clinking metallic noises, as well as a reprisal of the "In My Vision I Was on the Veranda" sample from Hyperborea. Not the only time on this rescoring where you hear a reprisal of a sample from the main album. And there's one moment of out-of-nowhere orchestral samples that move super fast but disappear really quickly. That's pretty cool too. There's also tracks like the more foot-tapping rhythms of City Wakes Up, which create a rather alien-sounding vibe that, again, maybe leans a bit more towards Biosphere's first 2 albums, but still does it very well. Probably my favorite track on this rescoring. Freeze Frames features some kind of industrial fan sound next to old-timey screeching violin samples and another repetitive sample of some kind of operatic soloist. Manicure seems to have a lot of field recording manipulation for splashing water with some military band sample placed way in the background. And there's suddenly all this whooshing air blasting all over the place with occasional individual synth notes and other clanking percussive rhythms coming in later, just all placed in the background. In the club, there's some creepy pianos and gurgling water dripping down a drain and an out-of-nowhere jazz band. And finally, the rescoring ends with Ballerina, which has all these dissonant and creepy bleeping rhythms all over the place, twinkling bell sounds and occasional old-timey 1920s jazz band samples, and other reprisals of sounds from previous tracks. It's all very strange and experimental stuff, but presented in such a way that it still fits with the other material here. And then there's the 2 Japanese bonus tracks, The Eye of the Cyclone and Endurium. They're once again material you'd easily find on his first 2 albums, and much more so than any of the other examples I've given. They've got like the old 90s drum machine techno beats and out-of-date synth textures. But not only do these tracks heavily benefit from not sounding like any of the other stuff here, if they'd actually appeared on Microgravity or Potashnik, they'd be pretty easy picks from favorites from there. The Eye of the Cyclone has a lot of cool progressions and moves along pretty quickly. I like how it starts out kind of subtle with all the strange percussion textures and then evolves into that kind of the fairy tale type ambient techno stuff and continually builds up as it goes on. And Endurium, while not having nearly as much progression over time, feels like a slow build-up that has a richer bass line, kind of creates this stormy menace to it and makes its 10 minutes go by really quickly. I might like it even more than Eye of the Cyclone thing, just thanks to the vibe it creates. Biosphere is all about vibe after all. Oh, and on the most recent reissues of the album, there's Laika, which acts as the big 14-minute album closer. Yeah, it feels like it's taking the album back into the cold ambient subspace that the main album created with its repetitive piano samples and synth stabs and very slow evolution. That said, it probably would not work inserted into the version I'm used to, with the bonus album coming first. It really only works to me as an ending, and I think if it were put in between Endurium and As the Sun Kissed the Horizon, it might actually take away from the power of the main album. I think it might actually work better if you tacked it on as a bonus track after Cyclone, and that would bring even more emotional catharsis to that ending. But I don't know. Needless to say, there's very few albums I know that utilize the bonus material as well as Substrata does. I don't typically recommend deluxe editions or reissues over the original versions of albums, but this is one very big exception. Most deluxe editions just had bonus tracks or demos that are little more than curiosities or stuff that wasn't good enough to make the album. But here the bonus material actively expands on the material on the main album, helps make it a more fun and a more varied listen than it already was, makes it feel even more expansive. And it feels like just as much love was put into it as the stuff on the main album. So yeah, that's all the insight I have for Substrata. So yes, I think the album's a timeless classic. I think most of you who knew this album before clicking on it already knew that. It's not like his first two albums, which feel extremely 90s and haven't aged all that well. This album may as well have come out right now and it'd still be incredible. If you've never heard a Biosphere album, this is probably the best place to start. Heck, if you've ever wanted to get into ambient music in general and are looking for some place to start, Substrata is an excellent, entry-level ambient album. It might be able to change your mind on the genre if you thought it was boring before. Well, possibly. It's still not the kind of album that's packed with tons of attention to detail, and has lots of stuff that you can miss if you don't put it on for repeat listens. No, it's not like that. It's more like the kind of album that just does a lot with a little. So yeah, I think that's about it. Substrata is an absolute must-listen. One of the best ambient albums of all time. One of my personal all-time favorites. And I'm overall feeling a 9.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me a review, something linked to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.